Hey, everybody, here's Dr. Elizabeth and me again for episode 3 of our,
Thank you.
of our series on The Sum of Us, a great book by Heather McGhee. You're going to hear more about her as we unfold today, but our topic, Elizabeth, is chapter 4, and I want to start off by asking you to explain the title. The title is Ignoring the Canary. Well, we know what canary they're talking about. What
hmm
is she talking about?
Well, that old familiar phrase, the canary in the coal mine that gives you the warning that the air is not in the tunnel in the mine shaft and you'd better get out. She's using it as a way to explain what was the financial crisis of 2008 and how it got to be that way. And the fact that and I didn't know this. This chapter was stunning to me. I learned so much I did not know. And I will preface what I have to say by saying that I am math phobic. I avoid anything that has fractions or graphs or percentage signs. So a lot of this information might have been out there, but it wouldn't have been something I could have taken on board at the time. The subprime mortgage crisis, which began hitting the white population in the mid 2000s, had already been ongoing in neighborhoods of Black and brown people. And it was not that they were buying homes they could not afford. It was that they owned homes that the banks were offering to refinance. Even if the borrowers had sufficient credit and equity that they could have gotten prime mortgage rates, they were harassed into signing into these subprime mortgages. And the Black and brown community was the first wave of the foreclosures. And because it wasn't affecting white people, nobody was paying attention to it in the larger context. And so I think what she's saying here is that what was happening to Black and brown families in the early 2000s was the canary in the coal mine. It was not just going to happen. They had perfected it and experimented with it. And the big mortgage companies knew what they had. And once they were able to get it going in the Black and brown communities, it went to the white communities. And then the whole house of cards came down.
Well, there is a place where we should slow down a minute and go over the vocabulary, right? You've already mentioned subprime loans and prime loans. The oddity of the word subprime means it doesn't mean a lower interest rate. It means a higher one that they are refinancing into. So it's a worse deal. And it's beyond me how anybody could sell those. I don't mean just from an ethical point of view, from a practical point of view, how could you get a customer to do that unless they were misrepresenting it?
Well, and she points that out. I mean, this is a story this is a chapter where a lot of actual human experience is what she uses to make the point. And she begins with what was going on in the Black and brown communities and the family that she talked to in Cleveland, I think. And the woman and her husband were pressured repeatedly by a white woman at Wells Fargo, who found common ground with the woman of color who was refinancing through her Christianity. And that common bond in religious experience and prayer is what made Janice trust the mortgage broker. And I was just appalled as I read that. And I'm still shaking my head.
Well, this practice of bilking people of color goes back a long way, going back before before the Civil War? One of the learnings, talk about things I didn't know before. There was established something called the Friedmans Bank. If I can find out the date of that, but it was set up in order to underwrite Black finances. Let's see, where is this?
She goes back into actually back to Reconstruction. I think it was 1867.
Right.
Where the Freedmen's Bureau, which had been primarily the people who were enforcing the civil portion of the 14th Amendment. Because the national banks would not loan money to Black people, the Freedmen's Bureau, which had been providing education and civic instruction and registering voters, became a bank for communities of color.
Right. So here was something that the then government did right. However, it was managed and then mismanaged into failure by white trustees. So there's just such a long history of taking advantage of disadvantaged people going back that far. And then the other one that goes back that far is none other than one of the villains of the Great Recession, or the 2008, is the Lehman Brothers.
Absolutely. I did not know this either.
I did not know this. Founded in 1845 and based on, again, taking advantage of disadvantaged people.
By mortgaging slaves.
By mortgaging what?
Slaves. You could borrow money with your slaves as the surety.
Oh, over slaves, right. Exactly. So there's a double injury that is just incomprehensible. But then came another learning, of course, is the amount of legislation that came forward that potentially could have remedied this situation for people of color, starting with the New Deal. But of course, all of that went awry. These great creations, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, 1933 and 4, had restrictions in them. And she tells the story a little different than I first learned it, which was that the things like the GI Bill and the FHA were at the federal level intended, of course, to be colorblind. The problem came because they were all administered at the state level or lower. And it was in that way that the ultimate purpose and benefit was subverted. And that's where redlining came into existence, a practice in which certain areas of cities were marked off as, not good risks, as they put it, quote unquote. And then beyond Lehman Brothers, you already mentioned Wells Fargo, another player, and Countrywide Financial. And when they had their pants pulled down, they went and blamed the minority population, the people that took out loans, by saying that, well, the government pressure to increase the service, loan service accessibility to people of color forced us to push these loans on people in order to meet our our quotas. And of course, that was a fib, because of course they had plenty of ways to do that without forcing them. They could have made decent loan arrangements. So it was an opportunity to fleece people.
Well, and that I think is the story that I knew. You know, was people who bought houses they couldn't afford and defaulted on their mortgages through these loans that were being made available. And that isn't it at all. And she has a sentence where she talks about that particular myth obscured the plain and simple truth. What was risky wasn't the borrower, it was the loan. And that hit me like a 2x4. And then she follows that by asking a question, you know, what is racism without greed? It operates on multiple levels. Individual racism, whether conscious or unconscious, gives greedy people the moral permission to exploit others in ways they never would with people with whom they emphasized. Institutional racism, of the kind that kept the management ranks of lenders and regulators, mostly white, furthered this social distance. And then structural racism both made it easy to prey on people of color due to segregation. That's a mouthful.
It's a sorry, sorry tale. You know, you mentioned the greed. One thing that just is beyond comprehension to me is the level of competition that there is in these financial industries amongst themselves. Obviously, for greater market share, as the phrase goes, and inventing, you know, going to the extent of inventing products that are practically imaginary that then you then sell on the financial market. And I think of the, you know, there has been a spate of films on this subject. Wall Street, The Wolf of Wall Street. I tried to remember and wrote down a few of them. One actually called Greed. But I remember somewhere in the early part of the Great Recession, after the wave broke, I remember a fascinating article in the New York Times by one of these, you know, Wall Street wolves, who was asked to explain greed. And he said, you know, it's very peculiar. Most of us are actually not greedy because, you know, we make money far in excess of anything that we can use to benefit anybody or even ourselves. He said it's abstract. It's all numbers. It's pride, if you will, you know, white male competitiveness that's focused on, you know, can I, you know, top the guy next door down the hall. And you can see that in the films too. But we forget that that greed as a word doesn't totally explain this very, very bizarre and evil syndrome that operates in our economy. And of course, who but our own Elizabeth Warren is the point person in fighting this, and she gets pushback from ridiculous directions.
Well, that's the other interesting truth I learned in this chapter. You know, I tend to think when I'm watching the Supreme Court, I'm looking at abortion, you know, voting rights. The changes that the Supreme Court permitted in the law, that if you were selling loans, even in a state that had good consumer financial protection, if you were incorporated in one of the states who didn't, you could you could supersede the state's consumer protections and charge, you know, whatever you did for the loan. I had no idea of, you know, somebody's going to get very angry with me for saying this, but I had no idea how corrupt the Supreme Court was and how complicit they were in all of these laws
Well,
that made this possible.
you could trace that even further back. I agree. It is beyond shocking. Trace it all the way back to the late 19th century Supreme Court, and I don't know the name of the case, but it's famous in most people's minds, where they declared that corporations could be regarded legally as a person, which involved a different set of standards and accountability than was the case in business itself. So those protections are unassailable now, and they are part of what has us boxed in.
Well, when you look at what's going on even right now, you know, the Citizens United decision that basically said, yes, corporations are people and their free speech rights include being able to contribute however much money they want to whoever they want. And then on the last day of the Supreme Court session, they overrode California state law that was, it just got out of my head what the actual proposition was, but it was a financial, a decision that the California legislature had made that charities must disclose the amounts of their donors and who their donors were. And the Supreme Court said, nope, they don't have to do that. They overrode the California law. So it's still there.
Right. So there's, that anonymity protects schemes and people dreaming these schemes up. It's when we talk at one extreme about the people who are greedy, the people who are the objects of this greed are in a state of survival, if you will. I mean, we overlook the fact, the degree to which people live from paycheck to paycheck, and that survival is really their full-time job. And it's not only one paycheck at a time. People are working more jobs than that. So it's really, a heartening development when we hear that, the minimum wage is going to be increased, and it has already started. Lots of things like that can give us hope, but boy, Wall Street is still there. And
well, and I think what makes this chapter as strong as it is that she not only tells the story of Janice and her husband and their neighborhood of color in Cleveland, but she tells the story of two white women, who were upper middle class white women,
right,
who lost everything. One of the women is, spent time living in somebody's shed that didn't have water or a toilet or heat. Just how close to the edge a lot of people, we tend to think the risky people are people of color. And this scheme put everybody at risk. This was a case of cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Now that's turning out to be the the mantra for this book. Well, listen, do you have any leftover thoughts before we announce the next chapter? I'm looking.
No, I just think this is such a stunning chapter. I mean, it makes me, I'm glad I know what else is coming in the book, because this chapter is enough to, make me want to play in traffic. It's just such an overwhelming construct that, the next couple of chapters are going to be about how this kind of oppression is fought. The next chapter is called No One Fights Alone, and it's about unions. There is hope if, we as citizens, we as Christians who, are called to be instruments of justice. We're going to see in the next couple of chapters some of the ways that we can be involved in making changes to this system and, ending exploitation. But I think it's really important that before we get to the remedy, we get a really good understanding of the problem. And I think this chapter does that quite well.
Well, I do too. And I was just checking the index to see if she mentions my favorite union organizer. I'll just tell you her name now, but maybe we'll add her to our discussion next time. In the late 19th century, Mother Jones, an immigrant, lived in Chicago and worked as a seamstress, and took umbrage at the exploitation of workers. Included in her story is the fact that she fostered unions that were integrated. We were talking about miners where there weren't a lot of slaves. But anyway, we'll talk about that next time. And Mother Jones is someone to whose memory we should hold up. Okay, then. Well, another great discussion, Elizabeth, and we'll pick it up next week at the same time. All righty?
Same channel.
That's it. Okay, then. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Blessings all.
Yeah.